In this video, I'm going to talk about this big 17-inch high-end gaming laptop from MSI, the Raider GE78HX. It is pretty much a desktop replacement and it is stuffed with some pretty powerful components. So this particular model comes with an i9-13950HX processor, 64 gigabytes of DDR5 memory, 4 terabytes of SSD storage, a 240 Hz IPS panel with 2560 by 1600 pixel resolution, a 175-watt RTX 4080, and of course, a pretty hefty price tag. So it will cost you $3,900 in the US without taxes, or about 4,300 euros here in the Netherlands with taxes, which is just a lot of money. So let's see how it performs and if and when it makes sense to consider one of these. Let's begin. The 2023 Raider is a big 17-inch laptop. It weighs a little bit over 3 kilos, and then even more so when you consider the bulky 330-watt charger it comes with. I do think MSI should consider using more compact chargers, which do exist, even for this wattage. But even with a smaller charger, this is not really a laptop you would want to drag with you every single day. It is really meant to be an alternative for a desktop PC, where for some reason a desktop PC is just not an option. It is also very clearly a gaming laptop with a big RGB LED bar in the front, some red details at the base, and big exhausts in the back. It is built pretty well though, with a metal finish on the lid as well as the keyboard area, and it just feels really sturdy. Even the hinges feel bigger and stronger than on last year's models. Metal finish does mean fingerprints, so do keep a cleaning rag nearby. It is easy to open it up with one hand, and there is very little to no flex present on the outside and on the keyboard, so overall build quality is again quite good. The keyboard itself is a pretty typical tactile keyboard with RGB lighting, and I personally really like this type. I thought it was really easy to get used to it, and I use a proper desktop keyboard on a daily basis. The touchpad is still a touchpad. It is very large with a glass surface and it does work just fine. But considering this laptop is a desktop replacement, you will be using a mouse most of the time anyway. In terms of connections, you get a Type-C port with Thunderbolt support, a full-size SD card reader, and a 3.5mm jack on the left side. On the back, there's the power connector, a Type-C with DisplayPort support, HDMI 2.1 and Ethernet connection. And on the right side, there's 2 Type-A ports and another Type-C port that can also be used for USB charging. Now that is really useful if you do need to take it somewhere, especially considering the size of the 330-watt charger. Just don't expect to game on a USB charger. I personally would have preferred if they moved at least one Type-A connection to the back, because right now, if you use a wired mouse, for example, the connection and its cable will totally be in the way of your hand, which can be quite annoying while gaming. But let's talk performance. So this model has a 13th gen i9-13950HX processor that has 8 performance cores and 16 efficiency cores with a total of 32 threads. That's 8 E-cores more than the 12900HX that was in the GE77HX that I tested last year. So in Cinebench R23, I got a score of 31,124, which is over 30% more than the 12900HX. Plus, it is also a lot more than the 13700H found in the Aorus 15 laptop from this year. If we look at the Blender render, it is actually an impressive upgrade from last year's 12900HX. But if you're on something older, a GE76 Raider with a 10980HK, for example, this is about 3 times as fast. And keep in mind, the 10980HK is not even 3 years old yet. And the single-core performance also made a pretty nice jump ahead. This laptop uses a 2560 by 1600 pixel panel, so it has more vertical pixels than a regular Quad HD panel. And you really want to run your games at this 1600p resolution. Each of the 11 games I tested for this video ran pretty well without any upscaling. Light games like CSGO, Doom, and Rainbow Six Siege really made the most of that 240 Hz panel, but you get a high refresh rate experience in most AAA titles too. Spider-Man ran with an average of 151 FPS, Valhalla ran at 126 FPS, and God of War ran at 125 FPS. Cyberpunk and Dying Light 2, which are still some of the heaviest games on the market, both ran over 90 FPS on this resolution as well. And Microsoft Flight Simulator was actually CPU bound at 82 FPS. But since this has a 4000 series GPU, you can actually use DLSS 3 and Nvidia's frame generation to get around that CPU bottleneck. So with DLSS 3 and frame generation enabled, Flight Simulator almost doubled its frame rate and you got a noticeably smoother experience. I also looked at both Dying Light 2 and Spider-Man Remastered with frame generation on, and then with all ray tracing settings turned all the way up, and that too showed pretty good numbers overall. Compared to the Gigabyte Aorus 15 with a 4070 and a Quad HD display, so with games running at 1440p instead of the 1600p, this Raider is a pretty significant upgrade. In Cyberpunk 2077, the Aorus 15 hit 63 FPS average, while the Raider does 101 FPS, which is about 60% more. In God of War, it was 84 FPS versus 135 FPS, which is another 60% more. And in Spider-Man Remastered, it was about 40% faster, but only because we're running into CPU bottlenecks instead of the GPU ones. And this is a much bigger difference than I expected, even if you consider the power differences. So on paper, the Aorus has a 140-watt RTX 4070, and the Raider has a 175-watt RTX 4080. But in reality, while gaming, the MSI was pulling close to 175 watts, while the Gigabyte was mostly pulling below 90 watts, and it never even went over 100, even though it's supposed to pull 140. So if you want to know more about the Aorus laptop, just check out my previous video about it, and I will leave a link in the description down below. Anyway, the display is very good and its color performance is actually excellent. It has a reasonably wide gamut covering the entire sRGB spectrum and about 95% of the P3 spectrum. And it also comes with multiple color profiles which are all calibrated perfectly. Both the default P3 and sRGB profiles, for example, don't have a single result over Delta 3, which is pretty damn close to perfect. It is an IPS panel, so contrast is not exceptional, but it is completely fine for an IPS technology. It does get pretty bright, reaching 459 nits, which makes it pretty okay for using it in a very bright environment. But it also dims nicely with a minimum white level of 23 nits, so it is also great for those of you that like to game in pitch dark rooms. In terms of speed, the total latency was just over 14 milliseconds. Now, the fastest laptops I've seen are in the 10 to 12 milliseconds range, so I would call this a very good result, and it would be great for those fast esports games. And the response times were pretty good as well. Now, it is not OLED instant, but in its default mode with overdrive enabled, most transitions were fast enough. Only going to complete black takes a bit longer than it should, but gray to gray is usually more important, and those results were just fine. There is a little bit of overshoot with overdrive on, but it's not that noticeable. Now, disabling overdrive does remove it, but makes most transitions slower, and that's not ideal either. So I think it is tuned okay, and I would just leave it on, to be honest. Now, MSI is selling this model with different configurations, and in terms of storage, this model comes with 2 SSDs in RAID for some reason, which doesn't really make sense. I guess it makes sense for marketing reasons, as you can show some crazy numbers, but if you look at an actual trace benchmark, it doesn't actually perform better than a regular SSD. I personally think it makes sense to buy a version without RAID SSDs or just set them up as separate drives yourself. Battery life was usually a big downside of big gaming laptops, and then especially so with an Intel CPU, but lately they've been doing pretty okay. In the modern office benchmark, which simulates light use, it ran out of battery in just under 6.5 hours, which isn't that bad. So with a Type-C charger, you could technically get through a workday just fine, or watch a movie or two without needing to wire it up. Just, don't expect to game on a battery, because if you do, the battery would go from full to completely empty in about 95 minutes. The webcam isn't that great for a machine with this price tag. Okay, so this is the test of the camera and of the microphone on the MSI Raider GE78HX. And I don't know, I don't really like it, I have to say. I have a lot of light in this room and it's still not nice in my personal opinion. It will be fine enough for some work meetings, but it doesn't really stand out. But the speakers do sound good. There's plenty of volume, bass is fine, and it's actually quite nice to listen to. But if you're gaming, I would definitely recommend a headset because the laptop does get really loud. In its extreme mode, I measured 55 decibels from a 50 centimeters distance, which is just obnoxious. It kind of makes sense because if you're running a heavy game like Cyberpunk, for example, it will have to deal with 70 watts from the CPU and 173 watts from the GPU, so it cannot really afford to run the fans much slower than this. And keep in mind, it does manage to keep those temperatures under control. It is just loud. You can swap to the gaming profile, which does lower the noise by a lot. Here it was doing about 43 decibels, which actually makes it one of the quietest gaming laptops I've tested so far. But this does lower the GPU power to about 137 watts, which does impact performance. So in Cyberpunk, for example, you go from 94 FPS average on 1600 pixels in extreme mode to 72 FPS in gaming mode, so it is about 23% slower. So I would say it kind of depends on your preference and your situation. If you're alone, for example, you can grab a headset and just go for the most performance you can get. But if you have people around you, you can lower it to a much more comfortable noise level and take the performance hit instead. But keep in mind, it will still give you a pretty good experience, just not the best one. When it comes to the software, I really think it was not as frustrating as Gigabyte software, for example, but there are still some things that can be improved, like having separate applications for most of the features. So there is a separate app for display color profiles, there's the SteelSeries app for the RGB of the keyboard, there's the separate app for the sound, and then there's the main software for the fan profiles and other hardware features, which, I mean, they all work well, but it does seem pretty messy. And I just do prefer having everything in one nicely compact software package instead. Anyhow, please stop having data collection on by default without asking for permission. To disable it, you need to go into a settings menu, and then when you try to disable it, it actually gives you this pop-up to confirm if you even want it off. Now, I'm pretty sure that there are some legal rules here in the EU about a data collection like this, and I did mention it several times already, but it is still there and you will have to manually turn it off. Nevertheless, I do think that most of what this GE78HX offers is pretty great. It is very well built, the keyboard is pleasant, the display is nice, and it just performs really well. And even though there are some small things here and there that can be improved, none of them are a deal breaker in my opinion. It is quite large and heavy, so it is not something you want to drag around with you every single day. It is a desktop replacement, and if you need a more portable machine, I would go for something lighter. The only real issue is the price. It is just extremely expensive. $3,900 in the US without taxes, or 4,300 euros with taxes here in the Netherlands, puts it out of reach for a lot of people out there. Not to mention that for that amount, you can easily build a high-end PC that will run even faster, buy a better display, and even buy a thin laptop to take to school or work, and still have some money for some nice peripherals on the side. So if you have space for a desktop, I would definitely choose to go that way. But desktops are not an option for everyone for various reasons, and that is why these desktop replacements exist, and from what I know, they actually sell pretty alright. And this Raider GE78HX is a pretty impressive machine that offers an impressive experience, and it would be great for people that don't want a desktop, that really want a high-performing gaming laptop, and then have a lot of money to spend on it. That's all I have for today, but before I go, let's check out the sponsor of this video. This video was brought to you by Corsair and their Elite LCD XT coolers. These premium all-in-one water coolers combine excellent performance with a fully customizable LCD screen that can showcase anything you have in mind. With a low noise pump and the AF Elite fans, they can easily keep up with the latest and hottest of processors out there while keeping your system quiet. You can install them on a variety of sockets, including the latest Intel and AMD ones, and once the installation is complete, you can use the iQ software to control the RGB effects or sync them with the rest of your Corsair gear. Check them out using the links in the description below. Thank you all for watching. If you liked this video, do consider clicking that subscribe button to never miss my future uploads. Bye guys, and see you in the next one.